Now we're going to cover colour temperature and white balance. Before we do, it might be an idea to have a look at the topic on colour constancy, which is in part 3 of the book, and there's also a video tutorial on that, and that helps explain the way the eye responds to different colours of light. Well, let's get back to the camera and colour temperature, white balance within the camera. So what do we know? We know that white light is a mix of all three primary colours, red, green and blue. We know that in order to see anything, we usually have a light source like the sun, which we call white light, and it must be sufficient to illuminate the scene. And we probably know that colour temperature or white balance is expressed in degrees Kelvin. So daylight is normally expressed around about 5,700 degrees Kelvin. And the Kelvin scale starts at the coldest temperature possible within the universe, absolute zero. And if you were to equate it on the Celsius scale, 273 degrees Kelvin is the equivalent of freezing point in Celsius, and it increments in the same scale after that. We intuitively know if the image has an overall colour cast. It looks wrong if it's got a colour cast that we perceive. So let's have a look at this image here, and the way I try to represent it, it should look pretty reasonable colour wise, and it's got a colour temperature of 4,150 degrees Kelvin. It was taken towards the evening with an evening sunlight. Just be aware that confusingly the image colours change the opposite to the colours of the light temperature scale. So when we're talking about temperature, the hotter you get, it goes to the blues. The colder you get, it goes to the reds. But when you're adjusting these images in Camera Raw, the change works opposite. So now we're going to a higher temperature, but it actually looks a yellower scale. If you work it out in your head, it does actually make sense, but I'm not going to go into that here now. So here we have a slightly yellow image, and it's been given a colour temperature of 6,000 degrees Kelvin. 9,000 degrees Kelvin changes the image into a more yellow image, and when you compare them side by side, you can tell the difference. 20 degrees Kelvin dialed in, this is in Adobe Camera Raw, would give you that sort of yellowy colour. Conversely, we could go the blue direction. Okay, so 3000 Kelvin applied to that image gives us a blue colour, a blue cast, and if we go to 2000 we get a very blue cast, and we can intuitively see that the colours are all wrong. There's still a blend of red, green and blue in each of these incorrectly balanced images. It's just that there's an incorrect balance of the red, green and blues. And colour temperature is a judgment call. It's an artistic expression. So light is energy, and it's part of a huge thing we call the electromagnetic spectrum. And each energy value or colour corresponds to an actual temperature on that degrees Kelvin scale. So light has an energy range of between 800 Kelvin to 20,000 degrees Kelvin, very red through to the violets. This energy range goes from deep red through to all the colours of the rainbow to violet. Okay. And there we go, through the visible spectrum. So this particular part, the visible spectrum, extends way into the infrared, microwave, way into the long radio waves, and in the opposite direction, higher energy, ultraviolet, X-rays and gamma rays in that direction. Okay, but we're just interested in this little area here, the visible light spectrum. So there's our scale again. So how does the Kelvin scale work? So if we imagine a black body with absolutely no temperature at all, it is pure black, it emits nothing. No energy comes off it, it can't, because there's no energy there. As we start to increase the temperature of this black body, it starts to emit energy long radio waves, microwaves, infrared, the hotter it gets. And it's an average. It emits an average range of, not just a single peak, but an average range of temperatures or parts of the spectrum. Okay, this is just an idea. It's not supposed to be a very accurate way of showing what's being emitted at that temperature. Now, as we heat that black body, eventually, maybe to about 800 degrees Kelvin, it starts to glow a dark red heat, and we're starting to see visible light. Okay, so now we're looking into the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. If we continue to heat the thing, the colors, the average colors change from red through orange, yellow, green, blue, then violet, all the colors of the rainbow. Okay, and each of these temperatures represents an average of the colors making up the light. So as we move from 800 Kelvin up here, you can see the average of all the colors moves as well. So different temperatures correspond to different photographic situations. So at sunset, sunrise, we may have a temperature, a color temperature of about 2000 degrees Kelvin, because all the blue light has been, well, most of the blue light has been filtered out by the atmosphere. So all we're left with is the red light. A tungsten light bulb, which uses tungsten filament to glow white hot, only has a temperature of about 2700 degrees, starting to get a little bit orangey. Daylight, which is almost a pure mix of red, green and blue, is 5700 degrees Kelvin generally. In the shade or on a sunny day, we may have a color temperature of 8000 degrees Kelvin. If you look in some of the shadow areas on a sunny day picture, you'll see that they appear a bluey color. Okay, because that is the light, the blue light that's been scattered from the sky into the shadow areas, blue light. And we can continue on into the ultraviolet, which we can't see. So let's have a look at white balance in practice. So white light is comprised of red, green and blue light. And light sources, like the sun, all emit different proportions of red, green and blue, which gives it a color temperature. So photographs' colors may not be accurate because they've been illuminated by light sources with different blends of these primary colors. The white balance setting on the camera tries to compensate for those imbalanced lighting conditions. So here we have very dark red heat. Okay, so we'll start off there, and we can see that this is an average of all the colors. Okay, so when it's really dark, there may be some slightly hotter areas, but it's generally peaking around 800 Kelvin. So 2000 Kelvin, we can move our average peak of colors. So the white balance setting in the camera, if we were to try and balance it to get the correct blend of red, green and blues, the white balance would try and greatly reduce the reds, because there's loads of reds. It would reduce significantly the yellows, the greens would be increased, and the blues would be greatly increased to try and get this nice blend of red, green and blue, assuming that we didn't want to take a sunset where we've got a nice red colour. Go to tungsten, and as we move it along, the camera has now got to change the way it blends these colours together. So reds would be reduced, yellows reduced, greens increased because it needs more greens, and blues increased. Okay, and as we move along to daylight, you'll probably find that reds are okay, yellows are okay. There may be a little bit of change, but generally we've got an equal blend of red, green and blue. That's pure white daylight. And if we go into the really high temperature areas, the camera would then need to boost the reds greatly because there's very little red here, look. So it needs to boost the reds. Boost the yellows significantly because there's not an awful lot of yellows. Greens reduce maybe a little bit, and blues greatly reduced. Okay, so, and that would give us a correctly colored image if it was illuminated by a color temperature of 8,000 degrees Kelvin. And on the back of the camera, if you set it to white balance, you'll probably find we've got some different settings here. So I normally leave it on auto white balance, so the camera will automatically adjust this blend of colors to try and produce the right balance of colors, irrespective of the ambient lighting conditions. And it'll change automatically just between about 3000 and 7000 degrees Kelvin on auto white balance. You can set it to a specific color temperature, daylight. Canon have decided that daylight is actually 5200 degrees Kelvin, unlike the film manufacturers that always said 5700 degrees Kelvin. But no matter what it is, certainly if you're using raw files, none of this really makes any it's not going to be permanently applied to your raw file. These are just like digital tags. If you're using JPEGs, it's really important to get this color balance right, because you can't really change a JPEG significantly without destroying. There isn't enough information in the JPEG to make radical changes, but with a raw file it makes no odds. You can change it however you like in the raw converter. In shade, Canon have decided the shade temperature is about 7000 Kelvin. Okay, so these just give you, if you wish to set a particular color balance, they're useful settings. But for general purposes, see, flash they reckon is 6000 degrees Kelvin, and here you can actually change it to whatever value you like between 2000 and 10,000 Kelvin. And you could use a color calibration chart to set that if that's what you're doing. Maybe if you're in a studio and you want all your pictures to be exactly the same color temperature, or some commercial setup that you're trying to take a picture of. Okay, so that's how we can set up the camera. But generally, if you take in raw files, auto white balance is great, because you can then adjust the auto white balance in the raw converter with no problem at all. Here we can see at different temperatures, here's the visible spectrum, part of the electromagnetic spectrum, and as the color temperature, well, as the temperature of something increases, and these are degrees Kelvin, you can see at 1000 degrees Kelvin it comes in and there's some red, yellow and green, and there's no blues or violets. 3000 Kelvin we're starting to get more of an accurate red, green and blue, and at 5777 Kelvin in this case we're getting virtually a full similar red, green and blue values, and as it gets hotter it goes more into the violet and the blue areas. So when auto white balance can get it wrong, this was a picture of a sunset, and the camera decided to try and neutralize a lot of the reds and the oranges and bring back the remaining blue areas. That wasn't quite what I wanted, but because it was a raw file it made no odds, because in the raw converter I could then just apply the color balance that I wanted. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a bit more of an idea as to what white balance color temperature is all about.